Do you understand the power of questions? Well, tonight we're going to explore how asking the right questions can help you to hack your brain and improve your life. How you doing tonight? Excellent. I'm False Prophet with Twisted Jenius, and on this channel we like to delve into topics like inspiration, entertainment, and psychology, all from a uniquely villainous perspective. And tonight we have something kind of interesting for you. We have questions and how they impact our psychology. In many ways, thought is just a series of questions. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that thought really is defined by the questions we ask. Who we are, how we think, how we perceive the world is tremendously affected by our questions. On the most basic level, there's always the question that our brain is constantly asking about the world around us, which is, what does this mean? Whenever something happens, what does that mean? This is a question, right? Because we need to know that. It's important for our survival, it's important for our happiness, it's kind of important for everything. We need to know this, and our brain is constantly asking itself that question and trying to come up with an answer for it. But the power of questions goes far beyond just simple instinctual things like asking, what does this mean? In fact, the specific questions that we ask ourselves every day have a huge impact on our state of mind and, by extension, our life. So, for example, if you're the type of person who's asking themselves, how can I improve? How can I become stronger, better, happier? That is going to, especially over the long term, lead to a much different quality of life than if you were to spend your time asking, why do I suck so bad? Why am I such a loser? Why does God hate me? Maybe you are an ultimate being of darkness and evil, and maybe God hates you for it. But you don't have to dwell on it. You can ask yourself different questions, reframe the experience, and change your whole life. Questions impact how we look at the world. It's literally how we contextualize and frame things. So, by asking the right questions and changing your questions, your brain will come up with different answers. And one of the most obvious scenarios where asking the right questions can come in really handy are situations that involve problem solving. So it's not that hard to tell why questions, or asking the right questions, are very important for problem solving. If you want a different solution, a different answer, essentially, to the problem, you should ask a different question. Pretty simple, pretty intuitive, right? But it's easy to forget. A lot of times we just kind of tend to ask the same questions over and over again and expect a different answer. So always remember that. If you don't like the answers you're getting, ask yourself a different question and see what happens. And one of the simplest things you can do when dealing with any problem, and for those of you who have not been paying attention, life is actually quite full of problem-solving scenarios. That's what makes up a large portion of life. So this comes in very handy. Just asking, am I looking at this the right way? Am I approaching this problem the right way? And asking that and genuinely expecting an answer, is there another way I can look at this or approach this? Or is there better questions I could be asking myself right now? It's very simple, but just framing it like that, just asking yourself that, can have a massive impact on the quality of the results you get, because you will see it, well, hey, maybe I'm not looking at this correctly. Maybe there's a better way to approach this. And just ask the question and see what comes to mind there. Don't be afraid to question your approach to things. Don't be afraid to ask, am I asking the right questions? Or is there something better I can ask? If you don't know what the question is, then ask that question. Is there a better question that I could be asking right now? One of my personal favorite types of problem-solving questions is, can I have everything that I want from this situation or this scenario? And the reason I really like this one is because I find that a lot of times, and you might discover this as well, that when we get caught up with a problem, oftentimes the problem, the source of the conflict, the source of pain there is that we don't feel like we can have everything we want. We have to choose between two or more options, and none of them seem that great to us. It's like we have to sacrifice one thing or another. But the good thing there is that we can step back and actually say, well, wait a second. Is there a way I can have my cake and eat it too? Can I have it both ways? Is there a way I can get everything that I want from this? And maybe there isn't, but it's important to stop and ask that, and don't just assume that you have to make a decision where you're not really happy with either outcome, because that's just silly. And if you discover, hey, wait a second, I can have everything I want, well, that's way better. And so that's definitely an important question to ask, and really consider it. Really think about how you might get everything you want. Oftentimes, those kinds of solutions require a little bit of creativity. In fact, asking, am I being creative enough about this? Am I looking at this from the right standpoint? And if you really don't feel like you can get everything you want out of the situation, then it becomes time to ask a different question. What is it that I really want? What is most important to me? What is actually my real outcome that I'm going for here? And that's another really important question to ask in regards to solving any kind of problem. What is it that I'm actually going for? Because it gets very easy to kind of get caught up in things where we look at the facts, we look at the details, we weigh things, but then we forget what the outcome is supposed to be, what we're actually going for there. And sometimes there's a simpler, more expedient route, and we just clutter it up with all kinds of other variables and ideas and tangents that don't really go anywhere, or that just make things more complicated than they need to be. And so it's really good to ask, what do I actually want out of this? One of the best ways to determine what you actually want out of the situation, this problem, this outcome that you're trying to deal with, is to, of course, ask another question: what's most important to me? We have to remember that all decision-making is value clarification. So before you ask yourself, well, what's my outcome here? Which choice do I want? It's very important to ask yourself, what's most important to me? And it's so simple and should almost go without saying, but it's also ridiculous how many times people don't actually do this. And all of this goes back to the idea of it's best to just stop and ask yourself these questions. Anytime you face a dilemma, you face a situation where you feel like you have this problem and you feel stuck, always stop and evaluate your questions. Ask different questions. Ask, how can I do things better? How can I get what I want? What is it that I really want? What is my outcome? And really think about these. Sometimes these things take a little bit of time as well. As a matter of fact, when it comes to this idea of taking a step back and asking the right questions, pondering the solution to a problem, we can actually learn a lot from the fictional character Sherlock Holmes. In the books by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Holmes was famous for doing this thing called a three-pipe problem, or multiple-pipe problem, where he would kind of stop focusing so much on the question, or at least actively searching out an answer, and he would sit and he would smoke, or he would play his violin. And we now know, through modern psychology, modern neuroscience, that this approach actually works. I'm not talking about engaging in heavy use of tobacco, necessarily, but by allowing our brains to kind of take a break after asking the question over and over again, it helps us to really focus a little bit, or rather not focus consciously, but it sets our subconscious to work. And we can find examples of this throughout history. Some of the greatest scientific discoveries, some of the greatest aha moments actually happened when people were doing stuff that was not seemingly related to the issue or the problem that they were supposed to be solving. So, for instance, how many times do you hear someone say something like, "Oh, I just had this epiphany, I had this great idea while I was in the shower," or something like that, doing some sort of mundane task? And the reason this works is because after asking a question, especially repeatedly, and really getting our brains to focus on something like that, our brains keep working even after we consciously step away from it and kind of occupy ourselves with something that doesn't seem as important, something trivial, something that isn't necessarily really helpful to solving the problem on the surface, but it gives our subconscious, that deeper part of our brain, time to kind of germinate and think about it, and eventually it'll give us an answer, especially if we obsess about the question over and over again. That's why business owners and scientists and other people like that, who are credited with coming up with just some really amazing ideas, will often have those sort of moments where they have obsessed about a question over and over again, ask themselves the same thing, but then it may just come to them when they're just kind of, half going to sleep or driving the car or something like that, because that actually works. And so you can't always expect an answer, especially to really tough problems, right away. But what you can do is set your brain to working on it there. Ask about it. Don't be afraid to obsess about it. And that way, you'll eventually get an answer. Your brain, your subconscious rather, has a whole lot of different resources that your conscious mind does not necessarily have. We store a lot of information that we don't consciously always have access to, but your brain can kind of go over that and file through it and work on that problem even while you're not consciously thinking about it. You have to set it to work. It helps if you get really obsessed about it and ask the same thing over and over again. Maybe remind your brain periodically, write it down if it's a really important question. Hey, how do I, solve this? And eventually, your brain will come up with an answer. It may take a little while, but the more you focus on it, the more you remind it, and then just take a step back and then go remind it again. And this process can actually work very well for coming up with solutions to really tough things, especially really important things that really matter to you. But you have to ask the question very deliberately, and you have to phrase it right. And you also have to genuinely expect a response. Expect your mind to tell you what you want to know. And that's often how some of the greatest ideas that mankind has ever come up with happen. But the power of questions actually goes far beyond just mere problem solving. Questions can actually be used to reprogram your brain to completely change your point of view for life. Because, remember, our thought processes, our very consciousness is often defined by the questions we're asking. That's what our brain is constantly doing. It's asking questions. So when you change the questions, then you change how you perceive the world. And that is an extremely powerful thing. In fact, that's the only thing you have any real control over. What you think and what you do. It's basic Stoic philosophy there. We can only control our own thoughts and our own actions. And so it makes a lot of sense to really do this. And one of the best ways to do this is to change the questions you're asking. But part of the secret with this is that you have to ask very specific questions and be very deliberate and careful about the type of questions you ask. Because if you ask questions that, are terrible, basically, you're going to get some terrible answers there. So what you want to do is ask questions that make you feel good and that lead you to the kind of conclusions, and in this case, of reprogramming your brain, the kind of mindset that you're really going after. So, for example, how questions are really great. How can I do this? How can I improve this? How can I get what I want? Those types of questions are just wonderful for trying to not only find the solutions to specific problems that you want, but also just training your brain to look at things that way. I've covered this in other videos, but our brains tend to pick and choose certain parts of reality that it's looking for. And so part of the trick to being happy or just generally getting what you want out of life is that you have to train your brain to pick out the certain things that are going to empower you, make you happy, lead you to the conclusions and the attitude that you want. Another type of question that I really like is what if questions. These are kind of dream questions here. What if I could do this? What if this thing that I'm not sure or think might even be impossible is actually possible? What if this happens this way? And when those are positive, inspiring, empowering kinds of what-if questions as opposed to what if the most terrible thing ever happens, the earth shatters, I burst into flames spontaneously. Though those, obviously, what-if questions aren't as good, but the kind of dream questions, what if the best happens, or what if something great happens, or what if I can do this, those are really good for getting your mind on the right track. They kind of train your brain to sort of look at things that way. And it kind of gets you into that mindset where, okay, maybe stuff is possible that I would have normally eliminated or just assumed wasn't. Because, once again, when it comes to reality, our brains actually don't have enough information to always determine what is possible or not. So it's best to kind of focus on what might be possible, and what-if questions are really great for that. And usually, what if and how questions kind of work together very well. How tends to be more practical, and what if is, okay, what if I could do this? Okay, well that's an interesting question. Good. How do I do that? And that gets you on the right track, and when you start looking at things with that kind of possibility, your life changes, your whole attitude towards life can be changed by those kinds of questions. Why questions can also be very powerful. But the way people usually use why questions is the opposite of empowering. It's weakening, basically. Why do these terrible things keep happening to me? Why can't I get ahead? Why can't I have this? Why am I such a screw-up? Why does nothing go right for me? These are the kinds of questions a lot of people ask in their heads all the time. And it's really important that you get away from those and replace those with better questions. Asking why something is occurring in a general way is not necessarily bad, but it almost always comes with a sort of presupposition rather. A presupposition that why is this happening is assuming that whatever you just said is happening. So if you say, well, why am I so lucky? Okay, that's great. Why am I such a success? That's awesome. But you have to be careful with those assumptions because it sounds like semantics, but when you assume something in the phrasing of these kinds of questions and you say those things over and over to yourself, your brain, your subconscious that doesn't deliberate, doesn't consciously, logically sort out stuff, always assumes that it's true. When you feed something into your subconscious like that, it just assumes that whatever it's being fed is true. It doesn't discriminate between true or false. It has a sort of dream logic there. So you have to be really careful about what you're feeding it and what you're saying to yourself. And that's why these types of questions, or any type of questions really, can have a really strong impact on your mind, but you have to be careful about what you're actually saying to yourself and what the exact questions you're asking, because your brain will come up with an answer. Why do I suck? Oh, well, it's because you're no good at anything. It's because you're lazy. It's because you're stupid. It's because your parents were horrible people. It's because no one likes you. You can come up with all kinds of stuff, but that's not great. So you want to be very careful about that, and you want to focus on the types of questions that are going to lead you to the kinds of attitudes, the kind of solutions, and generally the kind of life that you're looking for. Questions aren't just powerful for you to ask yourself, though. Asking other people questions can be just as powerful and can actually be a very important, very critical part of communication with other people. Here's one interesting psychology hint here. When you ask someone a question, even if they don't answer it externally, their minds will usually begin working on it. Quite often, they will instantly, an answer will pop into their heads, even if they don't say it. So when you're talking to someone, if you just ask them a question, you can usually be pretty sure their brains will come up with an answer, even if they don't tell you what that answer is. They're thinking it. And this can be a very valuable tool of influence, honestly. If you want to get someone to get on the same page with you, if you want to get them to see something that they don't see, asking them a question that's going to lead to that is a really great way to do that. And here's why that works. Because if you just tell someone, this is what you should think, this is what you should believe, if you're selling something, this is what you should buy, they can fight you on that. You're an external thing. You're something outside their range of consciousness. And they can, act like, no, you're wrong, or just try to push that out or deny it, or come up with a counter-argument for that, even if just in their head. But if you ask them a question that leads them to the answer that you want them to come to, they really can't fight that because they're coming up with the answer. Their brains are the ones answering that question. So, for example, let's say that you were trying to sell a product. Like, let's say you were trying to sell a car, for example. You could try to sell someone a car by saying, hey, check out this cool car. It's got all these features. This is why you should buy it. But that person could easily come up with all kinds of counter-arguments, and chances are, in most situations, they would, at least in their minds, possibly to your face, possibly out loud. But what if you were to ask them, well, okay, would you like a new car? Now, assuming the person's cooperating at all and being at all honest, most people would be kind of like, well, yeah, I'd like a new car. Okay, what kind of features would you like if you were going to get a new car? And once again, if the person's even remotely cooperative, they could say, well, okay, I would like this and this and this. And then you could say, okay, well, look at that. I've got a car right over here that has those kinds of features. Would you think this would be a cool car to own if you could own that? And once again, they might say, well, yeah, that would be a cool car to own. And what you're doing is kind of systematically getting them down to, hey, I might want to buy this car. Now, that doesn't guarantee a sale, obviously. But what it does do is it gets them to answer these questions, and it's much harder for them to object to stuff if they're the one who is coming to these conclusions there. And that's really powerful. Another example of this in selling is infomercials. Think about that. How many of those just classic cliche sort of infomercials have you seen? You've probably seen them parodied too, spoofed, where it's like, announcer will come on, have you ever had this problem? Oh my gosh, it's such a mess. So, well, now you need this great new cleaning system. That sort of thing, right? What they do there is they are asking a question, and then they are following it up with a solution to the problem that they're anticipating that your mind already came up with. Have you ever had this problem? And if you're in their target demographic, if you're the type of person who would want this kind of product, then yeah, you've had that kind of problem. And then they say, okay, so here's the solution to that. And that's really a powerful marketing tool. But you don't have to just use this this doesn't just apply to selling, though. In fact, you can use this to help people. So, for example, let's say I wanted to help you. If I was talking to you in person, not you. Yeah, you right there. Yes, that's right, you. And let's just say, I know you're not. I know you're really awesome, positive, empowered sort of person, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you were the type of person who actually did some of the things that we talked about in this video earlier, that you would say, how come I never can succeed? How come stuff never goes right for me? Well, I could say, well, okay, but you mean stuff never goes right for you? Can you think of one thing that did go right for you? And if you're being even remotely cooperative or honest, you would probably say, well, okay, I can think of one thing. Okay, well, what was that? And then you would hopefully tell me what that was. Then I could say, okay, is that the only thing that's ever gone right for you? And you would say, well, no, other things have gone right for me. So I'd say, okay, well, what are those? Has this ever gone right for you? And I could even deliberately pick things that would be so common, so universal, that there's almost no way that that thing has never gone right for you, because it almost applies to anyone, and I could ask you about that specifically and get you to say, yes, this went right for me. And that would begin planting the seeds that your statement about things never going right for you is just completely false. And of course it is. That's complete hyperbole. It's exaggeration. It's generalization. It's BS, basically. And of course I know that. But if I get you to say that, then that means that you came to those conclusions, and that is way more powerful than if I just told you, no, of course stuff's going right for you. You're doing good. It's okay. See, that's way, way more powerful there if I can get you to tell me how stuff is going for you, how stuff went right, because it begins to chip away at that idea. And if I take that far enough, I might even be able to get you to say, hey, well, okay, does this make sense then? Does any of that make sense? Does it even make sense to tell yourself that nothing's going right for you when you know it's all going right for you? Do you like lying to yourself? Is that good for you? And I could even drive you to saying, you know what, I'm going to start telling myself that, everything's going right for me. I'm doing really well. If I push that far enough, and if I ask you the right questions, that line of reasoning could take you to that place there. And that is really powerful for all kinds of human communication, if you really think about it. And finally, asking other people questions has one other very important benefit, and this one is completely obvious. You learn more about them. You learn more about everything. In fact, there's a lot of really great quotes out there that basically say the same thing, that if you just talk the entire time when you're actually speaking with someone, you only get the information that you came with right there. But if you listen to them, then you get additional knowledge. You walk away with more information than you had before. And one of the best ways, obviously, to get more information, to understand people better, to communicate with them at all, is to ask them questions. And, it's not always good to interrogate them, obviously. You don't want to, and some people like talking about themselves and some people don't, so you have to kind of, gauge that situation. But in general, asking questions, asking people questions about themselves is a great way to just build rapport, understand things in a professional setting. If you don't know something, a lot of times it really is better to ask so you know from then on. And yes, questions are very powerful when you're asking someone else as well as just the questions you ask yourself. And now I have an important question for you. Will you please subscribe to the channel? Because after all, you don't want to miss out on any of our cool content, our inspirational villainy and dark fun, do you? This is False Prophet with Twisted Genius asking, stay evil, and good night. See, so I wouldn't ask, how come I can never take over the world and enslave humanity? I would ask, how do I take over the world and enslave humanity?